Hi, I'm Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Good evening. It is so wonderful to be here with Dan. It's interesting. I actually met Dan in this very theater when he was talking about another book. And he said, "Can you get on a plane? I want you to go to this conference with me." And I did. I took a red eye and I went to this conference, and my life has been changed ever since. Dan is someone who, as all of you know, he's a world-famous interpersonal neurobiologist. The only thing that is bigger than his brain is his heart. And Dan is someone that I have had the good fortune of working with and really working on a core question. You know, how do you educate and cultivate healthy children, healthy young people who can create a different kind of world than the one that we are currently living in? And it's interesting because Dan has become incredibly involved with New Road School. Much of the climate and culture of New Roads and why it works is affirmed by Dan's research, and it finds expression here. And Dan, in his spare time, calls me every once in a while and says, "Can I come talk to the faculty?" And I'm always, "Of course, Dan." They're like, "Dan wants to come talk to us?" I'm like, "Yeah, he wants to come talk to you." And so tonight it's such a pleasure to talk with Dan about his newest book, IntraConnected. I actually was a part of a book group that Dan put together that really supported him in the creation of this book. And so the book has a very special place to me as well. And tonight we're going to cover a few different topics, but Dan and I know each other, and should I tell them we're both big kids, Dan? Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so we might wander a little bit, and so I hope that that's okay with all of you. But I'm going to start with talking about, why Dan decided to write this book, and then I'm going to cover the topics of intraconnected, identity, belonging, mental health, and well-being. Just a few topics, Dan. And then the role of education. And then we're going to look at sort of moving forward. So what I wanted to start with, Dan, was I wanted to start with this. At New Roads, we realized that great scholarship comes from a very personal place. And I know that this book for you came from a very personal place. Why did you decide to write this book now?
Well, let me start first with an apology. I actually have been away for a week way up north on an island with 6 monastics meditating. And I just flew back to Los Angeles, and I've started coughing from a kind of an asthma cough. So if I start coughing when I speak, I'm not sick. I've tested, and you may hear me coughing periodically. Why now? There's a feeling, and you guys are dark, so it's hard to see you, but we can just see from everyone participating that something isn't quite going right in the world. How many of you feel that way? Yeah, and
can we get a clap so you guys, we know you're out there?
Yeah.
Because all we see is darkness. We need to know you're with us.
We want to bring on the light. So that feeling you know, would just keep me up at night. You know, or I'd go to sleep and I'd wake up at 4 in the morning and be just feeling something's not quite right. And when I started asking people, friends, colleagues, patients even, it was a shared feeling. Something here in modern culture is just not going right. Because I had the opportunity to teach in different countries, and it wasn't just the United States. So I just started wondering, was there anything in this field that I've been working in for 30 years called interpersonal neurobiology that might have anything to offer in understanding kind of a way of both attempting to begin to answer that question, what's not going right, and then maybe offer some questions to engage a conversation together to see if there's something either from ancient wisdom or from new ways of pursuing things that might guide us in addressing what's not going right and course correcting. So the now of it was that feeling. And then, as you mentioned, this group of people were assembled, including yourself, where over the course when I was feeling like this book needed to manifest itself, I didn't feel like this body alone could create such a book when it was something coming from all of us. So if I were in different settings, like here, meeting you, and other settings, I'd see a sparkle in somebody's eye or a tone in their question that would just give me a feeling in my body like this person's on the same journey to try to deeply ask questions that don't just accept the status quo and wonder how might the world be. So anyway, so I assembled about 24 people, as you know, in a group that I called a pre-book book club. So it was the idea of a book on belonging, but the question was, what would this book be that would make people feel like it addressed this restless feeling, something's not right, what might it be, and what might we do about it? So that's how the group got started.
And what were those feelings underneath, Dan, that you were feeling that kind of brought you to saying it has to be now? What kind of feelings were you getting about the world?
You know, part of it was a feeling like some message was being offered about, you know, what life was about or what was important. That if you were a child in school or an adolescent, you know, growing into your maturity, that you take those messages and try to fit in. Or even as an adolescent, try to push against them, but still they were some kind of structure that seemed to have some kind of solidity and maybe even accuracy to it. And that in the course of trying to live a life where you were hearing the message and trying to figure out how you could work your life into that message, you were getting on a kind of rat race that never led to a real meaningful direction, but in fact made you try even harder, because when you'd achieve what the message was saying to try to achieve, then you still felt very unsatisfied, and then you just do more of the same, and then it would create a whole world of dissatisfaction and despair. So that was the notion, that there was something sort of embedded, kind of like a fish swimming in an aquarium that doesn't know the water is toxic, just swims in it. There was some kind of water we were swimming in that was hard to see because it's our atmosphere, but to try to look at that. Yeah.
Well, and I know, Dan, you took a lot of risk with this book. You know,
Yeah.
I know I read several different incarnations of this book in
3.
manuscripts because
Thank you for reading.
your sense was that this book needed to be in the right form in
Yeah.
order for the message to be compelling. Why? I mean, because I know I read one part of the book that was basically poetry.
Yeah,
And you really were experimenting in this book.
a 300-page rhyme. That's not an exaggeration. Yeah,
But
thank you for
why?
reading it.
Yeah, I did. I read every word. But why? Why the experimentation in the form?
You know, this is a book about our identity, what your experience of self is, and that the reader having an experience of self needed to be invited into a journey where the journey itself would allow in a gentle way how you constructed an identity about what that self is, the features that you use to characterize a center of experience called the self. That identity needed to be examined, expressed, and maybe even expanded in the course of reading the book, and that identity could shape the most fundamental need we have as humans, which is to belong.
Mm-hmm.
So, I did a couple of iterations that just didn't feel right, and then I was kind of stuck. We were in the middle of the pandemic. Our group was meeting, and you may remember this. Suddenly, this whole 300-page rhyming story about a person named Sam came out, and you followed Sam from before Sam's conception to Sam's death, and, anyway, I thought it was done, and then I gave it to our group.
Mm-hmm.
People seemed really excited about it. So I sent it to my publisher. She was whatever the opposite of excited is. So she sent
She thought she'd gone mad?
Yeah, pretty much. So she sent it to 2 more people because she knew she was a bit responsible, because she had sent me one of her favorite books to read to inspire me on the 3rd version of it, a book called Hidden Cities by, who wrote that? Called Valo or something.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and I loved that book. And so anyway, that's why it came out in that iteration. And then what I did was I extracted from the rhyme book, once that was rejected, this 4th iteration, which was to try to imagine the reader's experience. And I guess as a therapist, I do this all the time with my patients, but to really have a relationship with the people I have the privilege to work with as my patients, where we're on a journey together. We don't know exactly where it's going, but it really questions basic assumptions. So that's what the book became, was kind of taking what I learned from the rhyming journey of Sam, making a human developmental lifespan journey that the reader both experiences as a conceptual thing, and then they're invited to actually dive into that journey, so much so that, when I read the audio version of it, the audio engineer stopped being able to function as an engineer, and I had to go into his side of the booth, and I said, "What's going on?" Because he was spacing out. And I said, "What's happening?" He goes, "I don't know what your book is. It is a meditation. I'm changing as you're reading it, And I said, "Okay, that's good, but I need an engineer, so that's fine." So I explained to him what the book was about. He goes, "Hey, I got it." So that's what the book does. It's a very invitational, experiential journey. Yeah.
Well, I think this pre-book group, Dan, you talk about it as if it were sort of random in a way, but it was very clear to me, being a part of this group, which became, part of my chosen family, that each person had their really unique perspective, and yet we all felt connected in a space that was virtual. Because for a couple of years, we had not met, most of us, in person, but I felt like you were creating this experiment to basically demonstrate your theory.
Wow. Can you say more about that?
That basically that we are not simply, as you like to call it, the solo self. That is what is in, this skin. And, that we are connected to one another in a very profound way. And I think that recognition of our interconnectedness as people created this culture where people really showed up authentically, but they had this deep sense of empathy for one another that I've rarely experienced. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's so beautiful. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I've experienced with you, so literally it makes sense, and I can sense it, because, and Luthern, what you're describing, and just so people know, from the book club, when the book club was done, all the chapters were reviewed that weren't written yet, maybe it was about, 18 of us continued.
Mm-hmm.
So the other 6 left. And we just continued. And then when the viral pandemic hit, because we were already in a pandemic of racial
Mm-hmm.
injustice.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a pandemic of climate
Mm-hmm.
disasters and misinformation. We were in a pandemic of, the addiction to digital screens and social media. So we were already in pandemics. Then the viral pandemic hits, and the group had been meeting once a month and then started meeting once a week. And these were people, you're absolutely right. Actually, I'm the only one who ever met any of the people in person.
Mm-hmm.
None of you had ever met each other in
Mm-hmm.
person except in this group.
That's why I knew it was a plot.
But I hope it feels okay to be included in that. So then we were meeting every week, and in fact, on January 6th, we were all online together at the moment the Capitol was invaded, and someone put it up on the Zoom as their screen, and we were watching this all together, and so over time, ultimately, we were able to get together, but the love that was there was just amazing. And it was because this process of differentiating, being individuals as a me and linked as a we could live it in, and that's was so inspiring for me too.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think, Dan, it leads to kind of this next kind of piece with this IntraConnected, the title of this book, because, clearly there is a severe mental health crisis. You and I were talking about it, the newest article that came out, and the suicide ideation, the depression, the anxiety of children, it's reaching record proportions.
And just to clarify, in case you don't know what the number is, for females, for young girls, 1/3 of girls are seriously thinking about ending their lives. We're not talking about something that's rare. And if you are listening to this and feel this kind of sense of hopelessness and pain, there are suicide prevention phone lines to call and that are available to you. And even talking about suicide, you always have to be careful because people hear that and it can trigger all sorts of actions. So we want to really say that people listening to what we're about to talk about, there's help available.
And I think it's interesting because I think this gets to your thing that you said earlier about something is wrong. You felt that something is wrong. And as we talk about the symptoms of something that's wrong, we talk about what's happening with our children. We talk about the workplace violence. We talk about the dehumanization. We talk about the social political polarization. And in that, I want to, read you a quotation from your book about intraconnection. It said, "Intraconnection is the sense, perspective, and the agency of the self and the whole. In these bodies, we can choose to develop In these bodies, we can choose to develop the identity lens we are given at birth to maintain its flexibility of focus. Close up, we sense the body as the center of experience. Wide angle, we sense our relational connection with people, and wider scale, we can feel the full range of our inner and relational centers as the intraconnected self."
Yeah.
Now, how do you think this notion of the intraconnected self or the lack of awareness of it is contributing to what is wrong?
Yeah, well, in a huge way. And how that's happening, this is a hypothesis, but one of the common experiences people talk about when they talk about something not being right is the feeling of not belonging. That people are alone and disconnected in the world, And so if you look at a number of different ways of seeing in different cultures what the experience of belonging is, I had the opportunity to be in Namibia, in southern Africa, and we were able to go and meet with people in the tribes that genetically are thought to be most closely related to the original human beings, right? So we all seem to be related throughout Africa, and non-Africa groups are coming from the groups of the San tribes, basically. So we wanted to see if the language that these individuals had in these tribes reflected an ability to focus on the inner nature of our world, because we were from the Mind Sight Institute, so it was about mind sight. Anyway, so we're there, and they sure did. They had very complex ways of talking about the inner life. But there was this epidemic of treatment-resistant tuberculosis. There was a famine. There was a drought. And in the villages, when you went there, you saw people who were incredibly happy. So one night around the campfire, I asked a translator to ask one of the leaders of the tribe, was this observation accurate? Were his people happy? And I'll never forget, fire's crackling, we're sitting there, and he says to the translator, who translates back to me, he says, yes, my people are happy. And we are happy because we belong. We belong to each other in community, and we belong to Earth. And there's this silence, and I'm just soaking that in. They're facing so many challenges, but they're happy. And I'm thinking about our country, where we don't have these epidemic issues. We don't have famines overall. I mean, lots of people are really in poverty and starving. But for the most part, we've got this material stuff in this country and the highest levels of misery in the world. So then he turns to the translator who asked me the question, in your country, are you happy? And I knew what the statistics show. Statistics show we're not. And then he says, in your country do you belong? And that's what triggered, because I couldn't say yes to that, that's what triggered the feeling that, wow, maybe belonging is at the heart of some of the issues of modern culture. So then the question is, well, why wouldn't people belong? Why would they belong there in Namibia, in the village, facing all these challenges? But here, broadly in American culture, we have the most individualistic culture in the world. Now, there are subcultures within our country where there is a sense of belonging, and there actually are people who are happy, and there's a different cultural way of living. But in studying American culture, we see that this identity of individualism leads to this disconnection and a lack of belonging. So that's what brought up this feeling like, could it be that, though it may have started in European colonialist approaches to living, and there's this incredible book I'm in the middle of reading by the two Davids whose names I can never remember, Wengrow and Graeber and Wengrow, I think it was, called The Dawn of Everything, where they have this conversation between an indigenous scholar in the 1700s and a European scholar. And the European scholar says to the indigenous scholar, what's wrong with your people there in your world? You won't take money and you won't develop a capitalist system. That's the only way to be modernized. And so the indigenous scholar says, we're not going to do that. Can't you see that the minute people start acquiring stuff, they're going to have a competition who gets the most stuff, and there are going to be people who are left out, and the disparity will grow, and the misery will grow, and we refuse to do that. And in fact, they did refuse to do that. But what do you see in America? You see this whole message that the more stuff you can get, the happier you're going to be, is the message. But when you do the research, that's a lie.
Did you ever, it's interesting, Dan, I don't know if there was a book, and I think the right title was The Price of Privilege. And the psychologist did a research study and started out with dealing with looking at kids who were impoverished in the United States and sort of trying to look at how they did in terms of happiness and different metrics of well-being. And actually use privileged kids as sort of a control to look at them in comparison. And actually ended up writing a book because was astounded that on many of those metrics, not to romanticize poverty, but on many of those metrics that the kids of privilege actually were not doing as well.
That's right.
And this whole notion, and it seems like you're getting at this idea of privilege is kind of no guarantee of well-being.
Completely. And a related book is called The Spirit Level, where epidemiologists came to the exact same conclusion. But bless you, the more disparity you see, the more misery there is, right? But in terms of your issue about privilege, when when you get the message, the purpose of life is to get stuff and make as much money and have as much power so I can have as much stuff as possible. Think about what that creates. That creates a treadmill where, let's say you get 1,000 units of stuff and you don't feel happy or meaning in your life. So then you figure, I didn't get enough stuff. So now you try to get 10,000 units of stuff. Well, now you get to 10,000 and you're still miserable. So then you go, well, I guess it needs to be 100,000. So now, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty soon you're getting so much stuff and building factories to build stuff to sell to other people so you can have more stuff and they can buy the stuff, that we're just stuffed full of meaningless junk. Exactly like that. So it all falls apart. But the people caught on the treadmill are busy paying mortgages, and they have to earn more money by selling more stuff so they can pay the mortgage for this incredibly expensive thing that they bought, which they don't even need. Right? So we go round and round, and I say it like that because the sad thing is, and I just spent a week with monastics from Plum Village, Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery in France, and these were people who were on that journey who decided to go to a monastic life, the monks and the nuns. And it was fascinating to talk to them about the shift to leading a life of meaning without any stuff, and the deep pleasure and joy that they had about being alive. And they could speak directly to what it was like when they were on the treadmill, working this job and that job and trying to do this and this and this, instead of finding a way to actually offer to the world basic teachings about how to find true meaning in life.
So are you basically saying that we're disconnected from the meaning of life?
When it's individualism, I think we're at grave risk of being disconnected from what gives true meaning, and we're taking external messages of what will make us, quote, happy, and we try to live that, and we conform to that, and it's killing us. Literally, it's killing us individually, and it's killing us as a planet. And it's creating, if you look at racism, for example, and look at white supremacy, and look at the whole notion of it. It's like, okay, I've got to somehow assert that my group is better than your group. I mean, with this white skin and your skin, so I'm better. Racism creates this whole thing about good versus bad. It's totally based on that. It's not about, you're a human being, I'm a human being. How do we find a way to have meaning together in this world we share? And the same thing is true with the climate crisis, which is very much related to racism, by the way. When we treat Earth like a trash can, it's because we're saying, oh, our species is somehow better than the rest of nature, as if we're separate from nature. So amazingly, when you look at these pandemics, racism, climate destruction, misinformation, all these things, I think they can come back, in terms of your original question, they can come back to, let's call it the solo self. The identity of self, a center of experience, is only inside the body. And this is going to seem ridiculous, and this is why, the concept of this book initially may be like, what is he talking about? Saying the self is a synonym for the individual is the heart of the problem. Self does not mean the individual. But in an individualistic culture like the United States, we say those are the same terms, self and individual. You have self-awareness, self-compassion even, you have self-understanding, self-development, self-realization, self-actualization, self-regulation. They all mean the individual. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that you do your work in life around the self. So if you think the self is just your body, which I think is an error, a deep, lethal lie, then you live a life that's going to be a life of destruction.
Well, it's really interesting. I'm going to sort of, one of the things that we do at New Roads is the kids sit in council, and their four intentions: speak from the heart, listen from the heart, be lean, which means take the time that is yours and give space for other voices, and be spontaneous, which means don't try to say anything or or plan what you're going to say, and be present and attuned to the other person. And the last one is invite complementary and contradictory views. And interesting, the kids tell stories based on a prompt. And because our school is as diverse as it is, one of the things the kids constantly say is they find a web of connection with people they never thought they would.
Mm-hmm.
And so each of them has their own individual story, but they see our common connection.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and it seems like in some ways that awareness of our interconnected nature
Yeah. Well,
is at the heart of this.
exactly. Just so I can do a little boast on your school, how many zip codes do you have represented in your school?
Probably about 85.
85. Can you imagine one school that has 85 zip codes represented? Bravo. And Luthern runs an amazing school here, which is why I love it and love you, for the way you're really bringing this into the educational world.
Well, and Dan, one of the things that, and one of the reasons I'm at New Roads, I feel very strongly because of my own experience in education. My favorite line from Great Expectation is when Pip says, they tried to make a gentleman on me. And when I was in school, I was like, they're trying to make somebody on me.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to make me conform and fit into a box.
Yeah.
And in that process, they're lopping off different parts of me. And this notion, I think it's kind of captured beautifully, when you talk about this. You said, we each learn in our own way. Yet a standardized approach to education does not accommodate the inherent individual proclivities of learning that each of us carry. Such an approach offers little room for identifying a child's unique propensity to build on those strengths, or to help each of us develop differentiated ways of contributing to the collaboration of the whole. Often this approach does not develop a natural systems intelligence.
Yeah. Where'd you read that?
I found it in this thing somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. What comes to mind, I think I mentioned this in the book, is think about it this way. Like in your school, the way you're describing it is you're allowing the student to differentiate his or her or their everything.
Mm-hmm.
And in that differentiation, they can stand strong in the unique individual they are. But then, in sharing and in the respect and kind way they speak from the heart and receive from the heart, then you're inviting them to link, right? So that balance of differentiation and linkage we call integration, right? So here's a way to think about it. Your body, my body, all of your bodies, they're a collection of cells, right? And when the cells work together in their differentiated ways, we get a harmonious, healthy, vibrant, robust body. But if those cells start to act like, I'm the only thing in town, the body doesn't work well, whether it's autoimmune disease or other illnesses that can threaten our lives.
Or the country.
What's that?
Or the country.
Well, exactly. Or the country. So what that does is, it means that if individualism is the law of the land in a place like the United States, what it says is that the whole, W-H-O-L-E, the whole is not being respected as a system. Is the idea of systems intelligence. And so if you start, and this is the idea of an identity lens, if you start to look at, okay, there is the individual, the student can speak from their own experience. That's fantastic. But then the group starts to work together as a whole. Once they're differentiated, and here's the amazing thing about integration. Integration is not like blending. It's not like a smoothie. It's more like a fruit salad where you maintain the differentiated nature as you're establishing the linkage. And then the vitality that emerges is huge, right? And that's the idea of, this word intra-connected is, in comparison to the word interconnected. When there's a story in the book, but I'll just share it briefly here. I went out with some system scientists from MIT that I was working with to try to think about how to measure these things we were calling relational fields. What's happening right now between you and me and everyone in the room and anyone listening to this, that there's a field. Just like Faraday, Michael Faraday in the 1800s, talked about these things called electromagnetic fields. You couldn't see them with the eye. People thought he was nuts. And now all of our electronics are based on this thing that people thought he was nuts to describe. Electromagnetic fields are real, and they're really important. So might there be a relational field, in addition to there being Luthern here, this body called Dan here, and our communication where we're interconnected?
Mm-hmm.
Could there be a wholeness that is, from the point of view of the whole, intra-connected? That is, there's a wholeness, the intra is the withinness, that is the connectedness. So the word interconnected is one word we use. So in this retreat with these system scientists up in the forest, we were by ourselves for, 3 days, living in the forest. And then we came out, and we were trying to put words to what the experience was like. And my colleagues would say, oh, I was interdependent and interlaced, I was interconnected, I was interwoven. They used Thich Nhat Hanh's beautiful term, interbeing. All these terms were said. And then as we went around the circle, I was the one to speak last. And I said, I really resonate with what you're saying, but my experience wasn't inter anything. In these 3 days, I was the trees.
Mm-hmm.
I was the sky. I was the creek. I was the body. I was the stones. I was the clouds. And now that I'm speaking, there's a body called Dan speaking. But back then in the forest, I can't say it was interconnected. Maybe I would say it was. And I thought, what's the word we have in English for speaking from the connectivity within the whole?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, I guess the word is intra-connected.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone said, oh, yeah, intra-connected, right? So I went back to, when we got back to our computers, I started writing notes on what the experience was like. I would type in, I had this experience of being intra-connected, and the processor would automatically change it to interconnected. I thought there was something wrong with the processor. And I looked it up, there's no such word. And I thought, wow, if we don't have a word that speaks for the connectivity from the perspective of the whole, we're sunk. And that's when I realized I needed to write a book about the intra-connected nature of reality.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like all the social constructs, you and I have had a conversation about this before, whether you're talking about race, you're talking about class, you're talking about gender, you're talking about all of these social constructs are built on these binary oppositions, where you define something against something else, but you're really not defining the nature of what the thing is itself. And that basically they're set in opposition to one another. So it's not, for instance, what we try to get at here, which is, connection to self, connection to other, connection to the environment, as what identity really is. And when you and I were talking, I think I called you one time and I'm like, Dan, I'm like so excited. I think I have this idea about what intellectual rigor is. I said, it's an awareness of the interconnected nature of reality.
Yeah.
Do you remember when we talked about that?
I do. Mm-hmm.
And that basically that's what we're trying to get students, young people, to come to that, because without that awareness, there can be no empathy.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
See, when I was,
I'm supposed to be the interviewer here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Dan. Go ahead. Go ahead.
We are interviewing one another. So here's the question I have for you. Even the way you just said it, you said, connection with self, connection with other, connection with nature.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe taking on the word self and saying, is it worth the effort? Because we all grew up in this culture.
Mm-hmm.
So you were equating self with the individual, right? In that phrase.
Well, I think I was trying to describe what is the reality of the person in this body.
I see. Okay.
And that basically, but I think that the basic awareness is that this body is all that constitutes the self.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that really what we're trying to get at is that the self should constitute an awareness of the interconnected nature of nature. So that basically you're not setting yourself in opposition to those things.
So here's the second question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If, let's say in a school
Mm-hmm.
like New Roads, or let's say in
Mm-hmm.
a country like the United States, if there was a way to invite people to consider that if there's a word, like the word self, that is something that you feel, something that gives you a perspective, and something that you act on behalf of, right? I protect myself. I can see the point of view of myself. I can feel myself. And you know I'm an acronym nut, so this would be sensation, an S, P, a perspective, an agency, A, so it spells the word SPA. So if SPA is what defines what we mean by self, does it feel like it's worth it, let's say in a school, to teach kids from kindergarten up that you can sense the inner aspect of self in the body, you can sense the inner aspect of other bodies and the betweenness, so like the inter, and you can sense the whole of nature. You can feel what it's like to be a tree, not just to connect the body with a tree, but to be the tree. And if that's true, then you have a sensation that can be widened. The perspective, you can take the point of view of the body, other bodies, the relationships that are there, and all of nature, the perspective. And the agency then is when you are acting in the world, you're acting on behalf of the inner, that's the body, the inter, the relationships with other bodies, with nature, and the feeling of the intraconnected self would be that I am all these things. I am all of nature, I am all of humanity, and I'm all of this whole embodied reality. Does it feel like it's worth trying to have the self be extended like that, not removed? I know in some contemplative practice they say there's no such thing as self, self is an illusion, and I don't agree with that. I think there is a center of experience that has different ways of being grounded in the body, grounded in our humanity, and grounded in all of nature. But how does that feel to you as a head of a school? Is that too big an ask to try to transform things?
No, in fact, I think that's why the founders created the school. I think they sort of said, how do we create a school that will help this thing called the Great American Social Experiment work? And I think they realized that it started with kids from different backgrounds encountering one another. And through those encounters, they would be expanded. And they would, have an opportunity to become who they uniquely were, but also a recognition that in the stranger they could find themselves. And so I think it's a both-and proposition. So that by the end of their journey, if they're all sitting together, they recognize that each person brings a different gift, and that what they could do together, the potentiality of what they can do together is infinite. So it's kind of what we talk about as sort of, the plane of potentiality.
And from that plane of potentiality, what's amazing is you transform competition into collaboration.
Right. And it's interesting because one of our students, she wrote a senior speech, and she basically said, at New Roads, we learned that it's not a competition with one another, but that we're on a journey together to become the best version of ourselves. And I think, though, and so this goes back to this whole notion that you were bringing up with this competition, me against you, win or lose, and what this does to us.
Yeah, and I think that's what's creating the misery, because it's a no-win situation. Imagine if someone feels competitive, right? That's a natural thing. Why not compete against the world's problems like disease and poverty, so that when you win that competition, everybody benefits? Can you imagine a world like that?
Well, it's really interesting, Dan, because how much, all of what I do is for the kids. And it's interesting because just recently I came across a quotation by Sir Ken Robinson again. Education is not a mechanical system. It is a human system. And there are conditions under which people thrive and conditions under which they don't. This is precisely what New Roads hopes to provide, a human-centered education where young people are encouraged to trust creativity, find meaning in the flow between rigidity and chaos, and connect and collaborate rather than simply compare and compete. You talk a lot about
Now,
human
is that all of Ken's, or is that part
no,
of yours?
part of it is mine.
Yeah, part of it is yours. Okay, so
Yes,
we're,
part of it is the human-centered piece, Dan, and I guess part of what I always look to you for in terms of guiding and advising me as we are continuing to build a school and a school culture that is responsive to the world is what are we doing to our children by creating these schools that aren't human-centered?
right.
Where we're thinking about kids as disembodied brains without looking at them holistically as full human beings and giving them space to develop in a healthy way.
Yeah.
What's the cost?
Well, the cost, I think we had a thing on this when I said the cost is everything, you know? And I just want to pause for a moment because I had dinner with Ken Robinson once, and we were planning on teaching together, and then he died. And no one knew he had passed. Sir Ken has passed, but it just was a reminder of the incredible preciousness of life. So I just want to pause for a moment, and just say, you know, how grateful I am that we're having this moment, because you never know when things change in life, right? So Ken would always teach about the importance of curiosity and creativity. And he and I were advisors for another school in New York together, and you know, we tried to create that. They couldn't survive the pandemic. You here at New Roads have survived it. And I just want to say that if we can envision exactly what you're asking about, how do you take a child and invite them to actually hold on to their curiosity and creativity, but also hold on to their innate capacity to participate collaboratively with each other? So I just want to point out, in the science of empathy, you know, we talk about feeling another's feelings. We talk empathic resonance. We talk about taking another person's point of view, perspective taking. We talk about understanding another person, empathic understanding. But a fourth part of empathy that people often don't talk about is called empathic joy. And what it means is, if you do well, you in that body, I'm really happy. So what your senior talked about in that speech was all about empathic joy. This capacity to actually thrive with another person's success is the kind of world we have to create. Instead of the zero-sum way where, you know, somebody's got to lose, you know, for someone to win. That's ridiculous. And it's unnecessary, right? There is sufficiency in this world. And what we need to do is find a way to really have this empathic joy where we're really trying to support the greater good. There is a way to do it. Now, in the system we have now, it's built for competition and to put people down. And I think that's what people are feeling, you know. And when you live from the IntraConnected whole, you realize that when you're actually having empathic joy for all of humanity and all of nature, then you do things which we know how to do, by the way, even though, as the UN report that came out this week tells us, countries are not responding. Humanity is not responding, even though in 2015 we have the Paris Climate Accord, and I was just with the co-founder of that up in this retreat. You know, we know what we need to do. The countries can even sign off on it, and we're not doing it. And children are getting a feeling like, what are the adults doing that are destroying this world? So kids will describe things like, I feel like I'm in a world that is in decay. And they'll describe something's not right. Well, no kidding, because the whole system is designed for destruction, unfortunately. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Well, it's interesting, Dan, because I think you and I have talked about how children come and they have a holistic view. And
they start that way, yeah.
Yes, we fragment their understanding. And it's so interesting because when I'm having a bad day at New Roads, my favorite place to go is the elementary school. And I inevitably, you know, the K through twos, they surround me and they all want a hug at the same time. They want to see how big my arms are and how many of them I can hold at once. And they just surround me with love. And I think about this of being in this black body and, you know, black man. And it's interesting, while I think the color, you know, I'm sure they recognize the color, what's there in that moment is pure love. What do we do to that?
Yeah. What
happens to that? Could you tell us what happens to that?
Well, I can give you some ideas, but I want your ideas about it. You know, just from a brain point of view, unfortunately, you know, we probably have 50 million years of our history, all of us as humans, from our primate ancestors that show, when you study them, that we have in-group, out-group distinctions, that even in the same species, you'll say, that's the beta group, we're the alpha group, we're better than them, and the minute we get vulnerable, the beta group will do whatever they can to take over and become the dominant group. So we have evidence that probably for 50 million years we've done that. And then the groups that survive with limited resources, you know, grab those resources, so the dominant group grabs them over the subdominant group, right? So we've inherited that, all of us as humans. Now humans, in our almost form, you know, 5 million years ago, probably inherited the same capacity, in-group, out-group distinctions. But for the last few 100,000 years, for the length of time of Homo sapiens sapiens, our species, you know, we've had this in-group, out-group distinction thing. Now, this genetically determined neurological process of saying who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group, is especially activated in us when there's the experience of threat. So insufficiency, not enough resources, violence, this way that you activate your threat system. So in terms of what happens to it, bless you, we have evidence, for example, to show in a 14-month-old, these are studies done out of Yale, where you can find out, let's say a kid likes Cheerios at 14 months and doesn't like granola. And then you show them a puppet, let's say it's a green puppet that likes the Cheerios that they like, and a red puppet that likes the granola that they don't like. Then the puppets go away, the cereal goes away, and now the child's able to interact with the green puppet and the red puppet. Well, one puppet they treat with a lot of kindness and affection, hugging them. The other puppet they treat with hostility and dismissiveness. Now, if you thought it was all about, well, they don't, you know, they want to get their resources, you might think one way, but which puppet do you think was which? The green puppet, the one that liked the Cheerios that they liked, is the one they treat with kindness. Even in English, the word like is, someone is like you, and therefore you like them. So we have a history. I don't think parents sat down and said to a 14-month-old, listen, some puppet's going to come in and they're going to like the cereal, like, you know, so this is kind of built into who we are. So we need to recognize it's an inborn, probably genetically determined trait we have as primates to do an in-group, out-group distinction thing that's especially intensified under threat. So when you study adults in the same situation, they will absolutely treat in-group members with more kindness and care, and they'll treat out-group members with more hostility and even kill them. It's what genocide is, you know. So what we need to do in a school setting is teach kids that this is what it means to be human, that we do this, and we don't have to do it, but we're vulnerable to doing it. Take, for example, race. And you and I have talked about this, but there is no such thing as race. Biologically, it does not exist. There are population variations, and there certainly are cultural practices that we have, but the race is not a real thing. Racism is real, and what racism does is it creates a false category called race and says, that's not my in-group. because I'm this race, so that's the other race. It's based on a social construction, and it leads to death and despair. Right? So this is an example where you say, what can we do? I think if we just acknowledge that this is unfortunately what we've inherited as humans, and then do something actively, you can call it anti-racism, but we can also call it just being informed that this is a vulnerability we have. So, in our we group, we call it, the group we have many different racial groupings there, and what people describe, and I don't know how you experienced it, but many people describe, that kind of disappears. It's a non-issue. I mean, maybe you can speak to that, but it just becomes a non-issue because it's not. I mean, certainly you have a body, I have a body, but to make categories like race is just an artificial outcome of our genetic propensity for in-group, out-group distinctions. You try to look for some category. That's what I think happens to it.
It's interesting because it's funny. One of the quotations I pulled out of your book speaks to this. You said, though we may have some genetic variations across populations, some bodily features that are distinct and histories anchored in the land in different regions of Earth, there is no essential innate difference from one group to the next. We are a heterogeneous mixture of populations and peoples from disparate regions of the globe. Any human can mix and mate with any other human, blending the population variations each partner brings to the union. No matter our histories and our characteristic population features, you and I are the same species. We are all the same human family. Now, it's interesting, Dan, because it feels to me in almost every one of your books I've read, in almost every discussion that we've had, this is the point, that we are one human family.
Yeah.
And I think it's the point of New Roads, basically, to show the kids they're one human family. What is at stake for us if we cannot learn this lesson?
I think about what it's like now to be a child on this planet. And I think about what children and adolescents are asking of us as adults, to wake up to this feeling that something is really wrong. And part of what I'm going to say maybe is informed by having been a week with a very diverse group of dozens and dozens of climate activists, some from indigenous cultures, some from various marginalized groups in different countries, but all of us informed about the climate situation. When you look at the science of understanding what's happening to the planet's biodiversity and ecosystems, the cause, you could say, is fossil fuel, consumption and the way we're using materials, and that's true. But even after we know these facts, the human qualities of greed, of division, of seeing the self as separate from nature, are at the heart of what continues UN report after UN report to say we are going in this horrible direction. One of the authors that was there just wrote a book called It's Not Too Late. There were many other authors there writing books about the climate. And the issue was, if people go into despair and shut down, we're not going to be able to achieve what we need to achieve. If we don't get governments and corporations to wake up to this individualistic way that they've been comporting themselves in terms of laws from the government and in terms of literally what companies are doing that continue to destroy the planet, then children feeling and the adolescents feeling that this world is headed for a massive disaster are accurate perceptions. So in terms of what's at stake and what can we do, and and I said this on this retreat to these climate activists, I said, I don't know exactly why I'm here. I was invited to go, but because I'm not a climate scientist or anything. But I said, if there's any little thing that I can offer, I'd like to offer it. So this book is a simple offering saying, at the heart of all of that stuff, the greed, the individualism, the lack of seeing this larger picture of our connectedness to one another, is the way we cultivate our sense of self, our identity, and our belonging. So I feel absolutely that it is very possible to have this thing called self-construal, how the self is constructed, to be turned around in a very quick order. It's not going to take decades and decades, which we do not have. We have, according to all these folks that were there, we have a window that's less than 10 years for us to actually make a big shift in what we do. 10 years is not a long time. But self-construal can change quickly. So if we could reach, folks in all these different areas of life, government, corporations, individuals, schools. Some work I'm doing in Sweden is with something called the Inner Development Goals Project, which is to look at the human side of why people are not trying to do the UN Sustainability Development Goals, even though the goals are set up. This is what we need to do. This is what we can do. Report after report, this is what we're not doing.
But I think the thing that's hard, Dan, and you and I have talked about this, is that part of what started your career was realizing that psychiatrists didn't understand the mind. And that what was informing psychiatry, there's that people who were treating people didn't understand what they were treating. And I think when I look at schools, the underlying assumptions of schools are not built on accurate understandings of the mind, not accurate understandings of identity. And so it seems to me, unless some of these fundamental assumptions in some of these institutions shift, which will shift the frame of mind, that we can't really have change.
I agree. Yeah, completely. So I'll ask you a question.
You're supposed to be the prophet here.
No. We're all going to profit from this. And this is a question for everybody. Look, and I was feeling this because think about it, I'm getting up at 5:30 in the morning when the sun rises. I'm meditating. I'm silently eating breakfast. I'm going to these talks about, how to use the mind to support climate activists. That's what the whole meeting was about. Because everybody's burning out. People are getting to a lot of despair. So what I said to my dear colleague, Joanna Macy, she said, so many people are burning out, and yet we need people to keep on trying. And what I said is, if everything's experienced as a threat, you're just going to go into fight mode, flee mode, freeze mode, or faint mode, but you can't sustain that over long periods of time, maybe a few hours, maybe a few days, but not for decade after decade. So instead, if we could change from a threat state to a challenge mindset, where you then see things as kind of like dance partners. So that's the first step in terms of the inner work. That if people are feeling despair and shutting down, it's not going to work. If people instead realize we're all in this together, and this is, I think, and I have to be very careful because I'm really actually very optimistic, even though I might sound kind of down in this talk, or conversation we're having. I feel like we can do this. How can we do it? We can do it because self-construal is very changeable. If you let people from the inside out realize that what they've been told, that the self equals the individual, is actually a partial truth, and that in fact this center of sensation, perspective, and agency has this wider lens you can develop. So you are other humans, you are all of nature. People are incredibly capable of courage, creativity, collaboration, And so there are amazing things that can be done. We actually know what to do. It's not like we don't know what to do. We're just not doing it. So if the inner work of climate justice, of racial justice, of getting rid of misinformation, the polarization, is actually going deep inside, and the irony of going deep inside is you realize, whoa, who I am is not just this body, right? So it's a win-win-win situation because people are miserable living an individualistic life. The data is really clear about that. And when kids feel helpless and they're thinking of ending their lives, as the saying goes, when you feel helpless, let's encourage people to get helpful. Let's have people work together. When they find, as Picasso said, the meaning in life is finding your gift. The purpose in life is sharing it. So what if school was to let every child find their gift, what they're really excited about, what they have a lot of passion for, what maybe they have some propensity for, right? Let them find that gift, and then let them share that with the world. And think about if then it was all for the purpose of bringing a greater good into the world, you'd unleash this huge amount of creativity and collaboration. That's the kind of world we can create. So that's the inner journey, is to actually melt away self is just the individual, and let kids learn that. Is that addressing your question?
Yeah, it does. I just think, part of what feels challenging is we've constructed a reality that is so disconnected from reality.
When we say reality, which reality?
What I'm saying is, like, if we talk about, even with people, integrative complexity, that we are so much more than the constructs that are put on us. How it is that people describe us, categorize us. But yet that is the shorthand of how it is that people look at us.
Yeah.
And that becomes our reality.
Well,
even though it is not reflective of reality.
Right. Oh,
Do you know what I'm
absolutely. Yeah,
saying?
yeah. Well, there's a study that just came out last week by a colleague of ours, Mary Helen Imordino Yang.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what her study, and I'll send it to you, what her study showed was that kids who think exactly like you're saying, think outside the box, and she calls it transcendent thinking, where they're really questioning the assumptions society is placing on them. When she studied them years later, their brains are more integrated, meaning they're healthier and more robust and more resilient. So when you can encourage kids to have this transcendent thinking beyond what they're just told, they actually neurologically develop a healthier brain.
But I think schools tend to label those kids as something's wrong with them. That's the interesting thing, because I think that they don't fit in the box.
Well, isn't that strange?
I was one of them. They put me in opportunity
and
room.
And look what happened to you.
Yeah, it's actually. But I did learn some good wrestling skills in opportunity room. I have to say, but I was one of those kids.
Well, it's interesting. If your school is trying to have like testing to make sure you're fitting into the box, then anyone not fitting into the box is actually violating your standards of how you think you're doing as a school. You can see what the whole thing is a, quote, self-fulfilling
Well, I got up and
prophecy.
started dancing in class, so I guess that was, they considered that problematic.
Yeah. Well, Adele Diamond would say, no, you're actually developing your mindfulness skills, because mindfulness with movement and dance is much more productive.
What is the thing, Dan, that you really want people to take away tonight?
Well, here's what I'd like to do. Can I ask you guys, what are you going to take away from tonight? Maybe shout out a couple things as we go across. Anyone want to shout out a word or two? Okay, we're in trouble. Okay, fine. What else? IntraConnection. Spa. Mui. Hope. Community building. Collaboration. Promoting outside the box thinking from within the box. Yeah, good. Any other last? We're all in this together. I love it, love it. Say it again. Empathic joy. Get out in nature, absolutely. Stories. What's that? The corrosiveness of competition, absolutely. Any other? Gratitude. Yeah. So that's what I would say.
And I think, Ted, do we have time for a couple of questions?
There's a lot of discussion about the negativity of social media. Do you think there's anything that we can use social media for in a positive or positive way?
Yeah, great question. And you know, the New York Times article today reported on today's Vivek Murthy's public statement, which it really ought to be looked at. It's a 19-page analysis looking at that and warning that we need to develop more regulations from families, from schools, from the organizations themselves, if possible, from government. You know, that social media for adolescents is potentially extremely dangerous. Now, I'll just say that I was asked this question about 10 years ago. I was on a panel in Australia, and so I said certain things back then when it was sort of social media was just starting about why I was concerned about it. And there was another professional there. She said the same thing from England. But then a researcher got up and said, you got to be very careful because we just did a study of 100,000 adolescents, and what it showed was that for the majority of adolescents, there's a positive way that social media leads to increasing face-to-face time, but for a minority, it actually is extremely negative in their lives. And that's actually what the report says, is that we got to realize that there are some positive aspects of social media, but when you look at the correlations of the social media use, and of course, probably most people have seen, what's the documentary? The Social Dilemma, exactly. You know, that the people who designed social media, you know, studied addiction to figure out how to get kids addicted. So in the video that I think was put out by the New York Times on adolescent distress, there's one quote that basically says, you know, adolescence is a time of great misery, but on social media, everyone who's miserable is putting up these images of them as really happy, but they're not. And so you who know you're miserable, look at the media presentations and it makes you feel worse because you don't realize everybody's feeling miserable. So it was an incredibly, if you watch this little 15-minute video, it's unbelievably powerful. They talk a lot about suicide and a lot about the feeling of helplessness that youth are having. So I would urge you to read our Surgeon General's report and, you know, have discussions with adolescents about it, and really keep the lines of communication open. If you're talking about your own adolescent, you know, really talk about it, talk about what it's doing, because it is this, we haven't gotten into the social brain much, but you know, when you look at the way the brain is wired and the remodeling of the brain during adolescence, it is a setup for disaster for adolescents to turn to social media, especially if they're vulnerable already, you know, and use that as some proxy for, you know, how I have connection, when in fact, even though there seems to be this hyper-connectivity, the superficial nature of those connections are incredibly meaningless, even though you're drawn to them and you evaluate your own worth based on, you know, how many likes you get and all these other things. So it, especially if a child is vulnerable, you know, it's a serious toxic environment that they can get caught up in.
I really resonated with your comment on transforming competition to collaboration. And I'm also a believer that the compassion is such a lacking trait in our society with the fierce competition. But I feel like compassion is something very fragile that you need to keep developing, practicing, whereas things like feeling of fear or anger is something more immediate or innate with our kind of human nature. And I'm just wondering, what's your perspective in terms of practicing compassion as family or with kids or as a village that it becomes a norm and becomes easier to practice rather than kind of, not be able to manage the feeling of fear or anger. And
Yeah, I think that's a really fabulous question. And let me just point out a couple of things that sometimes come out in the media that people will pit inappropriately, but these are academics who actually are doing this. They will pit empathy against compassion. And they'll say things like, compassion is good, empathy is bad. And you'll see books written about like this from endowed professors of this and that. And they may sell books saying things like that, but it's really an error, because for 98% of humanity, you need empathy as a gateway for compassion. There are certain trainings in certain monks where they can go straight to compassion. Now, I say this because you can actually look at the brain networks of empathy, and they're distinct from the brain networks of compassion. But with empathy, as we've said, you've got resonance, you've got perspective taking, you have understanding, you have empathic joy, but you have a fifth aspect of empathy called empathic concern. And what that is I'm using my empathic networks to sense your suffering, or even sense the suffering in this body. So now what I do is I activate a different set of networks. So this is where compassion comes in, where I'm going to do three things. I'm going to now, yes, feel your suffering, and because of empathic concern, I care about your suffering. But now, as I'm feeling your suffering, I'm going to now imagine, what can I do to help alleviate your suffering? That's the second part. And the third part is I'm going to do it, even if it's just being with you, bearing witness, or maybe it's taking action in the world. Now, here's the challenge of compassion, is people will think that if I am already overwhelmed in this world, why in the world would I take on someone's suffering when it'll just throw me over the edge? But the research is really clear that with compassion, there is no such thing as compassion fatigue. There's empathic resonance fatigue, but when you're cultivating compassion, what it's doing is it's giving you this large container in which to hold someone's suffering, and then to activate the channels of helping that person. So there's a book I wrote called Aware, which starts with the analogy of a container. And if you only have the container that's like the size of an espresso cup, then what happens is, if let's say someone's suffering is like the equivalent of a tablespoon of salt. If you dump a tablespoon of salt into a little espresso-sized cup of water, it's too salty to drink. It's true. But with compassion training, what you're doing is you're widening that container. In our case, it's this wheel of awareness where we make the hub of the wheel really big, like 100 gallons. And now, if you're addressing someone's suffering, and it's a tablespoon of salt, and you mix it into 100 gallons of water, because of this training, compassion training, you've learned, because you're expanding consciousness basically, that you have the ability to hold the suffering of another. And in that holding it, a person can feel that you are with them. And here's the amazing thing, that as you join with another, even in their suffering, this state of integration is massively expanded when you go from person A and person B to now AB is an entity. And in holding that compassion, you actually increase the state of integration. So there's this vitality that comes even when you're bearing witness for suffering. So I agree with you completely. Compassion training is like that. In medicine, I was just teaching to the, the American cardiothoracic surgeons. They had me come give a talk on compassion. And I remember when I was in medical school, my first patient died. And I went away with the resident to be with his body. We said goodbye to him. We've been taking care of him for months. I was crying. Anyway, that afternoon I was with my attending who was reviewing how I was doing. He said, "Daniel," he goes, "I noticed you left rounds this morning." I go, "Oh yeah, my first patient, Mr. Smith, he died, so I went to be with my resident." And the attendant goes, "Why did you leave?" I said, "Well, we had been taking care of him for 2 months, and he just died." And then I started crying. And he goes, if you're going to be a doctor, there's no time for tears. Now imagine what it's like to be trained to be a physician in that kind of medical socialization process. So I dropped out of school. I didn't want to become that kind of doctor. And I ultimately came back with this word mindsight. But years and years later, I was asked to teach all of the Stanford Medical School faculty because they had 2 residents end their lives. And they brought me in to sort of teach them about this mindsight business. And by that time, 56% of postgraduates in medicine were either severely depressed, anxious, or thinking of killing themselves. 56%. So I was working with the medical faculty around when we don't teach compassion to a clinician, they don't learn the skills of taking that espresso cup size container. So they say what that ridiculous professor said to me, there's no time for tears. I mean, how ridiculous is that? The way we live in life is to feel and give ourselves the space to have time for tears. That's how we have connection and collaboration, is we don't run from our own feelings or the feelings of others. Anyway, so we have to find socialization processes like medicine and like education and like government. I mean, I've done these same kind of teachings in different parliaments around the world, where we need people to be able to feel what they feel fully and not run from that, even if it's in terms of the planet, even if it's about eco-grief, so that rather than running away from our grief, we feel it, and then we move forward, and we take care of what we need to take care of. So I guess that's the long answer is yes. We need compassion in our world, and that can be trained, and you can teach this in school. Mm-hmm. And when you teach to widen that container, then compassion becomes a privilege that you feel grateful for. In no way is it a burden. And you see it as really creating the greater good.
Well, one of the things that you said, Dan, was this, in what you just said was, it's almost if you dehumanize yourself, can you actually be humane with another?
Exactly.
Can't give what you don't have?
Well, I know people, they go numb and they block themselves from feeling fully, and it's understandable. So I'm not trying to, say we can't understand why, if you're not given that training, you shut down and say there's no time for tears, just using that phrase. But what we want to do is support each other with deep listening and this capacity to open that container. And it's literally a teachable skill to go from an espresso-sized cup of consciousness, basically, and open that awareness. And what people do, it's just a win-win situation.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think in schools what's missing, because when people think about schools, they think about the triangle of pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. But I think you and I have talked about this. They miss climate and culture through which all of that's mediated. Mm-hmm. And without that climate and culture, you can't sort of cultivate thriving human beings.
Exactly. Yeah.
I hear you say, that we have 10 years to turn this around, and I feel bereft when I hear that. And I see it in my children, who, by the way, attended this school, happily so, Jesse and Virginia Finney. 10 years doesn't sound okay to me. It doesn't sound like anything positive actually can take place in 10 years. So could you speak to me personally about that?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And let me be really clear about what the science says about those 10 years. So this isn't my opinion. I'm quoting, hundreds, if not thousands of scientists are saying this. That it isn't that in 10 years the world ends. That's not at all. I hope it didn't sound like that. Okay, but I want to make sure, because some people say, oh my God, the world's ending in 10 years. That's not what I'm saying at all. what I'm saying is when you look at the system of Earth and what human actions have been doing to our biodiversity, to our climate, to all sorts of things. I mean, there's a lot of ways we can talk about that, but I want to talk about the emotions of it. Then when you look at the science of all of that, the year 2030, so now it's actually 7 years. I'm being a little generous with the 10. Sorry. But listen.
Now you're going to feel worse.
But what people are looking at when they're looking at the trends, and if you go to innerdevelopmentgoals.org, you'll see the Swedish organization where these things are clearly spelt out, and we're working with the United Nations in the Sustainability Development Goals, which clearly spell them out. You can look at the UN report from a couple of days ago, which clearly spells it out. So this isn't like Dan's opinion. These are like thousands of scientists supporting what I'm about to say. Is that we as a human family are emitting so much carbon into the atmosphere that the whole way in which things are changing will then create this cascade of, it's called a positive feedback loop, but it's basically if the temperature rises to a certain amount, and I'm not going to tell you the degrees, but it's basically a couple of degrees centigrade, then the melting of the ice and all the other things is going to lead to this catastrophic situation for our living environment. We still have time, as Rebecca Solnit's book, It's Not Too Late, says, we still have time. It's this decade. We first heard about this stuff a long time ago. We heard about it certainly in the late 60s, early 70s, and basically we've done nothing. That's 50 years ago. Some reports suggest that when many of us were adolescents, me for example, we've lost now over 2/3 of the species that existed 50 years ago don't exist anymore. 2/3. So we're going in this trajectory of mass extinction. Now, as adults here, we need to embrace the feeling that you're describing. It doesn't feel good. It feels horrible. And what the people tend to do is they either deny it and continue their consumption approach, or they go into despair and just become very depressed, right? So this is a tender line between denial and then being aware of and going to despair. So I've just spent an entire week with climate activists who are devoting their entire life to this issue. And in private meetings, the feelings that they're describing that are just like your feelings, and these are people who have spent decades working in this area, but they are exhausted because governments are not really doing anything, really, and corporations are not doing anything. And the UN reports keep on saying we are continuing on exactly the path that we cannot continue on. So when you read those reports, Glenn Albrecht is a philosopher from Western Australia who writes about something that a lot of people now are talking about called earth emotions. And to be truly compassionate with our inner experience and to be compassionate with each other, we need to name these earth emotions. One of them is called solastalgia, which is basically a feeling of longing for a biodiversity that used to exist. When I do the tide pools at Leo Carrillo now, which I used to go to as a kid, I go there, those pools are empty. I feel exactly what you're describing. I feel this incredible solastalgia. I go, my God, what happened to the world I grew up in? Now, I can just deny it and go, oh my God, a bad day at the tide pools. But I've gone back many, many, many times. There's nothing there. And, you can do things like my daughter is getting her doctoral degree here at UCLA, and as she beautifully tells me, Dad, I'm devoted to the direction. I'm not going to be obsessed about the outcome. I'm going to get my doctoral degree, and I'm going to contribute whatever I can to this world, but I can't be obsessed about the outcome. So that's the idea, like, to embrace these earth emotions is to embrace solastalgia, it's called eco-grief, eco-anxiety, and to realize that as adults, we're in this position, okay, we've kind of lived the bulk of our life, but think about if you're just 15.
Not only just 15, Dan, it's really interesting because the kids know this. They know it. I mean, people are saying, why are they filled with anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation? They know. And they feel that they've been abandoned by these adults who are not making decisions in their best interests. And it's interesting. Something happened 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago that I never had. We have in the elementary school, the kids do wonder projects, and we basically allow them whatever questions on their mind. We teach them compassionate systems thinking to break these larger questions down. And 2 years ago, in the first grade, 70% of the projects were about climate change. This is what's on their mind.
Absolutely. Their world is challenged. So in terms of the feelings and helping you personally and helping all of us, listen, I really believe that if we transform what feels like a threat into a challenge, that's step one. You can do this with your own mind. Number two, you can realize, as my daughter says, you can actually get involved. And if you want some really exciting books to read, read Paul Hawken's 2 books, Project Drawdown and Regeneration. Paul Hawken, Hawken. They are incredibly upbeat books about the 100 top things that are being done now to actually turn things around. Now, we need to do it at a larger scale, but they're being done. And just to say a pitch for women, if you take the top 2 things of the 100, if you take the 2 that are related to females, educating females and empowering women around this planet, you will get the number 1 thing to actually turn this climate crisis around. Right? So there are actually things you can do. There are organizations to get involved with. Just go to Inner Development.
We need to get rid of men.
But no, you don't get rid of men. But the men are the ones that are in charge. You know, so there are lots of positive things to do. But the first step inside your body is to recognize if you're in a threat state, if you're fighting or freezing or fleeing or fainting out of collapse, feeling helpless. That state is not sustainable. So you have to move to a challenge state. And then there really is a way to say, look, we're in this together as a human family, and the way systems change is they go through a period of disorganization before they can reorganize. So one way of seeing this climate crisis is it's a climate opportunity. Basically, Earth is telling us what we described in the beginning, like something isn't going right. Something massively isn't going right. The individualism of modern culture is destroying Earth. And our kids know it. So when I was on this trail, after meditating, I was hugging this tree and I started wailing. When I came out of my wailing, I looked down. You know, there's these carbon where the tree grew out of this burning, and there's this beautiful, beautiful hundreds-of-year-old tree. That's the kind of way you can say we have to disorganize, which is where we're going. Society, you can feel it, is in a state of massive disorganization, so it can reorganize, and there's an opportunity for something really beautiful to grow out of where we are. So I wake up now every morning having written this book, and I do suggest you read the book because it is actually a book of hope. The last part of this book, this section, is all on hope, because it says, look, this period of reorganization is terrifying, but it's necessary. And what we need to do is support each other. Kids, adolescents, adults, we need to support each other, but we cannot put our head in the sand. We can't say it's just business as usual, because it's not going to work. We do have this window of opportunity, and to get to your question, why did I write this book now and not 10 years from now? Because when I heard about that, it also made me feel just like you're describing. And I said, whoa, 10 years? What can I offer to that? Well, we all have something, you know. It's called pervasive leadership. We all have the ability to take leadership, and even if it's a leadership to come from this meeting and say, I will no longer equate the self with the individual. I'll live as not just a me, but also a we, so I'm a we. I'll integrate those two. We can do this. We really can. The question is, will we? And that's up to each of us to bring into this world a way of saying, seeing the self as just the solo self, the individual, has gotten us on the wrong path. Think of it as a splinter. You know, the splinter in the psyche of the modern soul is a concept that the self is the individual. We can actually remove that in our lives. And instead of limping along and destroying our gait, we can actually walk with balance through the world. That's what I hope an interconnected way of seeing life can offer all of us. It's a very upbeat, actual way. I'm very optimistic. We can do this. Let's go ahead and do it.